Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a tense and emotional story where James secretly investigates Tu Diep's mysterious past, only to discover strange gaps in her records and a truth that might change everything. Could the DNA test reveal a secret that will destroy their love forever? Stay with us to find out. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. The night James decided to look into Tu Diep's past, the world outside his window was strangely quiet. The city lights shimmered faintly through the glass of his apartment, but inside, everything felt heavy. The words his father had said days earlier still echoed in his mind like a distant thunder that refused to fade. James had replayed that conversation again and again. Every pause, every expression, every unfinished sentence, the implication that there might be something between him and Tu Diep that neither of them understood. He had wanted to ask her directly. Many times, but every time the thought crossed his mind, something inside him stopped him. Because James knew one thing for certain: Tu Diep believed she was an orphan. She had always said it simply, almost casually, as if she had learned to live with that fact a long time ago. She rarely spoke about her childhood, and when she did, the details were vague. An orphanage, a few teachers she remembered, a life that had begun without parents and continued without them. She didn't know who her real mother was. She didn't know who her father was. And that was exactly what made everything so unsettling. If his father truly knew something about her past, then somewhere, somehow, there had to be a trace, some record, some forgotten piece of information hidden in the past. James leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "I need to know," he whispered to himself. But he also knew he couldn't tell Tu Diep what he was about to do. So he made a decision. He would investigate quietly. No questions, no accusations, just the truth. The next afternoon, James contacted someone he trusted, an old acquaintance who worked within the administrative record system. It took a few favors and several hours of waiting, but eventually the call came back. "I found something," the man said over the phone. James drove across the city immediately. When he arrived, a thin stack of documents was waiting for him on the desk. "These are the records connected to her name," the man explained. "Not a lot, but it's what exists." James thanked him quietly and took the files home. Later that evening, he sat alone at his desk, a dim lamp casting a warm circle of light over the papers. Outside, the city continued its restless rhythm, but inside the room, everything slowed down. He opened the first document, an old birth certificate. The paper was slightly faded, the ink worn in places. He studied every line carefully, his eyes scanning each detail. Next came a school admission form from her early elementary years. It listed the orphanage as her guardian at the time. Then there were several documents from the orphanage itself: intake forms, notes written by caretakers, records of vaccinations and schooling. James flipped through each page slowly. According to the records, Tu Diep had been brought to the orphanage when she was still very young. No family accompanied her, no father's name, no mother's name, just a single line written in the intake report: "Child delivered by unidentified woman." James frowned slightly. Who was that woman? Why had she never been identified? He continued reading. Most sections regarding her biological parents were left blank. Entire spaces that should have contained names, addresses, family history, empty. As if someone had simply erased that part of her life. But one detail stood out clearly: her date of birth. Unlike the missing names, that information had been recorded precisely. James leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Then another memory surfaced in his mind. Years ago, he had once overheard fragments of a story from his father about a woman. Her name was Dieu. His father had loved her once, long before James was born. It had been a passionate relationship, or so the story suggested, but it ended badly, very badly. James suddenly sat up straighter. Slowly, he pulled a blank sheet of paper toward him. He wrote 3 things down: the period when his father had been with Dieu, the approximate time when they had separated, and the birth year written on Tu Diep's documents. Then he started comparing them. For the next several minutes, the only sound in the room was the quiet scratch of his pen. He checked dates, calculated months, reconstructed timelines in his head. When he finally leaned back again, the results surprised him. The timeline didn't match perfectly. According to the records, Tu Diep had been born sometime after Dieu had already left his father, not immediately after, but long enough that it created doubt. James stared at the paper for a long moment. "If this is accurate," he murmured. Then the conclusion seemed obvious. Tu Diep couldn't be his father's daughter. The thought brought him a small, fleeting sense of relief. Maybe his father had been wrong. Maybe the past had simply haunted him for too long. Maybe the suspicion had been nothing more than an old man's unresolved resentment. But the relief didn't last. Because when James returned to the documents, something else caught his attention. Some of the records didn't look consistent. Certain documents had been issued years later than the others. A few details appeared corrected, as if information had been replaced or rewritten. One form even had a small annotation stating that the original record had been updated due to missing data. James's brow tightened. Why would orphanage records be corrected years later? Why would certain details be incomplete? The more he examined the files, the stronger the feeling became. Something about Tu Diep's past didn't fit together. Something had been hidden. James slowly closed the folder. For several days afterward, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Every possibility crossed his mind. Maybe the documents were wrong. Maybe his father had misunderstood something. Maybe both were true. But there was only one thing in the world that couldn't lie: DNA. Late one night, James sat alone in his apartment again. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. In his hands was a photograph. It was a simple photo, just him and Tu Diep standing together, laughing at something outside the frame. He studied her face in the picture, her bright eyes, her effortless smile. Then he exhaled slowly. "There's only one way to know," he whispered. "If DNA says we're strangers, then this nightmare ends." The next morning, James stood in front of the bathroom mirror. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he reached up and pulled a few strands of his own hair. He carefully placed them into a small sample envelope. His hand trembled slightly as he sealed it. A quiet fear had begun to grow inside him, because if his father's words turned out to be true, then everything between him and Tu Diep would become something terrible, something unforgivable. Later that day, James met Tu Diep as usual. She greeted him with her familiar warm smile. "James, you're late today," she teased lightly. "Traffic," he replied with a faint smile. They walked together through a quiet park, the afternoon sun filtering through the trees. Tu Diep talked about ordinary things: her day, a funny story she had heard, a new cafe she wanted to try. James listened, nodding occasionally, but his thoughts felt distant. He was carrying a secret she couldn't imagine. Then a gentle breeze passed through the park. Tu Diep brushed her hair back as the wind lifted it slightly. One thin strand drifted down and landed against James's sleeve. He noticed it instantly. For a brief second, he hesitated. Then quietly, without drawing attention, he picked it up. His fingers closed around the strand of hair. And in that moment, something inside him felt heavier. That evening, James drove to a private DNA testing center. The building was modern, sterile, and brightly lit. Inside, a receptionist greeted him politely. "I'd like to request a DNA relationship test," James said calmly. The employee handed him several forms. After filling them out, he placed the 2 sample envelopes on the counter. The employee examined them briefly. "So this is for a kinship test?" she asked. James remained silent for a few seconds. Then he nodded. "Yes." She typed something into her computer. The results should be ready in a few days. A few days. Those words echoed strangely in his mind. James left the building and stepped back into the cool night air. The city lights flickered around him as cars passed by, their headlights streaking across the dark streets. Everything looked normal, but inside him, nothing felt normal anymore. That night, James sat alone in his apartment. The desk in front of him held two things: a small receipt from the DNA center and his phone. Time seemed to move slowly. Minutes stretched into hours. Then suddenly, his phone vibrated. A new message appeared on the screen, from the DNA testing center. James picked up the phone slowly. His thumb hovered over the notification. For a moment, he couldn't move, because he knew one thing. Once he read that message, everything might change. He swallowed quietly, and in the silence of the room, his thoughts whispered one final question. If the truth comes out, will we still be able to look into each other's eyes, Tu Diep? James stared at the glowing screen for several seconds without moving. The message notification sat there quietly, waiting for him to open it, but his thumb refused to press it. It was strange. Just moments ago, he had been desperate to know the truth. Now that the answer might be right in front of him, fear crept into his chest like a slow shadow. He placed the phone back on the table. "Not yet," he murmured under his breath. The room felt unusually quiet. The soft ticking of the clock seemed louder than usual, echoing across the walls as if time itself had slowed down. James leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Images of Tu Diep drifted through his mind. Her laughter when they first met. The way she squinted slightly when she smiled. The warmth in her voice when she called his name. Every memory felt painfully vivid. What if those memories were about to turn into something forbidden? James ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "No, it doesn't make sense," he whispered. He picked up the documents from earlier again. The copies of Tu Diep's records he had taken from the administrative office. The birth certificate, the orphanage intake form, the school admission papers. He spread them across the desk one more time, studying every detail under the dim desk lamp. The birth date remained the same, clear, precise, but the other information still bothered him. Why had the names of her parents never been recorded? Why had several documents been corrected years later? Why would an orphanage update records that old? James tapped the table thoughtfully. "Someone changed something," he muttered. But why? His mind drifted back to his father, Mr. Juan, a powerful man. A man who had spent decades building influence and wealth. A man who rarely spoke about the past. But whenever the name Dieu appeared, something dark always flashed across his face. James remembered the tension in his father's voice the day he warned him about Tu Diep. That wasn't just anger. It had sounded like fear. James opened his eyes slowly. What exactly happened back then? Outside the window, the city lights shimmered like distant stars. But inside the room, the silence felt heavier than ever. He picked up his phone again. The message notification was still there. DNA Test Center. He unlocked the screen. The message preview appeared again. "Your test results are ready. Please log in to view the full report." James stared at the words, "Ready." The truth was now only one click away, but instead of opening the link, he locked the phone again and set it aside. Because another thought had suddenly appeared in his mind. Something that made his heart beat faster. The documents. If the past had been altered once, then it could have been altered again. James stood up abruptly. He grabbed his coat and car keys. Within minutes, he was driving through the quiet streets toward the old orphanage where Tu Diep had once lived. The building still existed, though it had been renovated over the years. The sign outside looked newer than the photographs he had seen in the records. Lights were still on inside. He stepped out of the car and approached the entrance. A middle-aged caretaker opened the door. "Yes? Can I help you?" James offered a polite smile. I'm looking for some information about someone who used to stay here many years ago. The caretaker hesitated. Records that old might be difficult to access. I understand, James replied calmly. But her name is Tu Diep. The woman's expression shifted slightly. You know her? Yes. She used to live here when she was very young, the caretaker said slowly. But that was a long time ago. James nodded. I've seen some of the administrative records, he explained, but there were gaps, missing information. The caretaker looked at him thoughtfully. Most of the children here came without complete backgrounds, she said gently. That's not unusual. James leaned slightly forward. But were there any unusual circumstances about her arrival? The caretaker frowned as if searching her memory. I wasn't working here at that time, she admitted, but I remember hearing a story from one of the older staff members. James's attention sharpened. What story? The woman lowered her voice slightly. They said the child was brought here very late at night. James felt a chill run down his spine. Late at night? She nodded. Yes, someone left her at the gate. Did anyone see who it was? The caretaker shook her head. No one clearly, just that it was a woman. James felt his chest tighten. Did she leave anything? A note? Identification? The caretaker hesitated again. There might have been something. James's eyes widened slightly. What do you mean? The woman glanced down the hallway, then back at him. I remember hearing that the child had something with her when she arrived. What was it? A small cloth pouch. James leaned forward instinctively. What was inside? The caretaker sighed. I'm not completely sure. The older staff member who told the story said there was something inside that pouch. Something important. What happened to it? James asked quickly. The caretaker shook her head. I don't know. After many years, records and belongings sometimes disappear. Disappear, the word echoed inside James's mind. Or, the caretaker added slowly, someone might have taken it. James froze. Taken it? Yes, she said quietly. Sometimes relatives come back years later looking for a child. James's heart pounded harder. Did anyone ever come back asking about Tu Diep? The caretaker thought for a moment. Not that I know of. James nodded slowly, though his thoughts were racing. A child left at night. An unknown woman. A mysterious pouch that vanished. None of this appeared in the official documents, which meant one thing. The story had never been fully recorded. As James walked back toward his car, the night air felt colder than before. He sat in the driver's seat but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he looked down at his phone again. The message from the DNA center still waited there. The truth was ready. Yet somehow the past felt even more complicated than before. James leaned his head back against the seat. If the DNA result confirmed what his father feared, everything between him and Tu Diep would collapse. But if the result showed they weren't related, then another question remained. Why had someone hidden her past? Why had someone erased her family history? And why had his father reacted so strongly to her name? James slowly picked up the phone again. His thumb hovered above the screen. The night was silent. The city lights flickered across the windshield. And in that quiet moment, James realized something that frightened him even more than the DNA result. The truth might not end with the test. It might only be the beginning. His thumb finally moved. The screen unlocked. The message opened. And just before the result appeared, James whispered softly into the darkness, "Please, let this not destroy everything." James becomes troubled after hearing disturbing hints from his father about Tu Diep's past. Unable to ignore the possibility that something is being hidden, he secretly begins investigating her history. Through a contact in the administrative system, James obtains several old documents, including her birth record, school admission papers, and files from the orphanage where she grew up. While her parents' identities are missing, her birth date is clearly recorded. When James compares these details with the timeline of his father's past relationship with a woman named Dieu, the dates do not perfectly match, suggesting Tu Diep may not be connected to his father after all. However, several inconsistencies and altered records raise new suspicions. Determined to uncover the truth, James secretly collects hair samples from himself and Tu Diep and sends them for a DNA test, beginning a tense wait for the results.